Thank you so much for letting me the possibility of talking about the fusion of objectivism and art. And a special thanks to the organizers for making this venue happening in Georgia and Tbilisi. Who's from Georgia here? Excellent, excellent. I'm very glad to be back in your country. I was here once before, but I've since been longing to come back. A friend of mine, Fredrik Segerfeldt, have just released a new book in Sweden about his travels and his travels around the world working for different think tanks and the Swedish employer organization. And the title of that book is Nationwide Alert in Georgia, since he actually caused such an alarm by getting drunk and getting lost at a UN conference in 1997. A reminder that things were a bit more chaotic then as well. But I've since, now I can go back and tell him that I was there when people were alarmed by the government oppression and protested against it, and that serves as an inspiration. Just as last time I was here, I was inspired by the reforms and the progress that were made after Kaka Benedictsen. So I'm very grateful to be here. To my topic, thank you so much. There is an irony in my chosen topic, because the background is that I have published Ayn Rand's books in Swedish. I worked with the release of all her novels and also made a selection of essays that have only been published together in Sweden. This started with the release of Atlas Shrugged in 2005 on Ayn Rand's 100th birthday, the 2nd of February. And I remember that date because 1 year later, I didn't know then, but exactly 1 year later my son was born. He's named Ludwig after von Mises, by the way. Anyway, this release was a labor of love. We had printed a lot of copies, 5,000 for the small Swedish market, and did not have much money for marketing. So what do? Well, we decided to make it talked about by selecting 51 persons, public intellectuals, businessmen, politicians, and others, who got a copy paired with a personal letter and a page to look up in connection with a character or a happening. So, for example, a financial entrepreneur, of course, got the likening to Francisco d'Ancona and was asked to give his money speech. And one person at the public health authorities who had suggested a fat tax. We compared, if this book was taxed by intellectual content, it would be banned as well. And then, of course, suggested her to look up Ma Chalmers and the project Soybean. One who got a copy was Horace Engdahl, then chairman of the Swedish Academy, most famous for deciding the annual Nobel Prize in Literature. You know, he had the kind of fame that usually connected with intellectuals writing books. They're held in high regard, but most people haven't actually read them. He was also very much into postmodernism at the time. Can you guess, anyone, which character he was likened to? Bolf Eubank, the famous character in Atlas Shrugged. For those of you who haven't read it yet, it's not a flattering likening. And so, well, I had to eat my words because my topic today, in defense of luxury, how liberty, prosperity, and art thrives together, is actually borrowed or stolen, depending on your view on intellectual property rights, from this very author, Horace Engdahl. In a book last year, he in a way came out as a friend of markets and liberty, tying them to what he has worked with all his life, culture and the arts and how they can flourish. In this book, Tram Rides with Mr. Hume, which I think is unfortunately only available in Swedish, Mr. Engdahl engages in a fictive discussion with the English 18th century philosopher and historian. David Hume is, of course, much known for his epistemological skepticism. Some of his most devout followers have even ascribed to him a law, Hume's law, that you cannot deduce an ought from an is, and hence that facts are irrelevant for morality. Personally, I think that Hume would have been skeptical to that interpretation. But Engdahl engages with other parts of Hume's oeuvre, especially the value he sees in human interaction. The art as the art of conversation. Hume saw the process of presentation and critique as vital to the art of thinking. Having to present your ideas so that others can understand them, and even finding enjoyment from the presentation, is part of making your own thoughts clearer and life more interesting. We've seen some examples from this, right from Robert and Leopold, not the least. They're the professionals of presentation. As you can tell, I'm a bit more of a text guy, but I'm doing my best to come through anyway. And anyway, this way of working probably affects your view on philosophy as well. If you think about almost all the philosophical killjoys throughout history, most of them turn their back to the world from their universities, from their monasteries, seeing the separation from social life and earthly enjoyments as a prerequisite for delving into some deeper theoretical truth. And it's often boring, heavy, and hard to follow, not only the ethics from these thinkers, but the reasoning as well. Hume, on the other hand, had a fond feeling for all the parts of a good life, from food and beauty to spiritual conversation. He got rich by the sales of his book, The History of England, and got his taste for this life fulfilled in the French saloons at the time. This life also enriched his thought. And the point here that I want to make is that developing your thought and developing your taste for the good and beautiful in life are part of the same process, neither of which is to be ignored. This is a sometimes underappreciated part of Ayn Rand thought as well, not only in the sense that Rand chose as a way of presenting her ideas that is a skill in itself, the literary novel, and very successfully so, judging not only from sales, but from the fact that we discuss her ideas decades later at this very event. And admittedly, there is often critique of both the parties, the participants, and the host. And this is where Ayn Rand's sense of humor comes to flourish. This is a point which, parenthetically, is developed in Timothy Sandefur's excellent book, Freedom's Furies. I hope that those of you who haven't read it will read it. It's about Ayn Rand, Isabel Patterson, and Rose Wider Lane in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, when people are going communist, people are going fascist, everything goes wrong, very much like some of the tendencies in politics today, I'm sorry to say. But how these thinkers mobilized ideas that countered this development. And here, Timothy Sandefur notes that Rand picked up some techniques from the author Sinclair Lewis and writes very eloquently about that. Anyway, the substance of Rand's critique is not that it's superfluous to seek enjoyment of throwing a party. The critique is directed against seeking to separate enjoyment from accomplishment. The beautiful from the intellectual, or any of those popular dualism often traced back to some kind of mind-body dichotomy. The betrayal that Rand describes about among most participants at social gathering is both that their intellectual bromides are shallow and misguided, and that the people uttering them are not really enjoying themselves. They're not having fun. And that in itself is a crime. The lights, the dresses, the drinks, the exquisite food are taken for granted and sneered at or ridiculed by the second-handers and moochers. And that is as much a treason to life as it should be as plotting to socialize a factory or seeking fame for what others have accomplished. Ayn Rand, in other words, teaches us to have respect for the beautiful, exciting, entertaining, or simply nice aspects of life. Her heroes are famously not only intelligent and moral, but also often, not always, but often, good looking. You know that this is the thing, one of the things she got most vilified for by critics, that often claiming that looks shouldn't be important. And they're right, of course, that you cannot judge a person's moral character from what they look like, whether they're good looking or not. But that is not, of course, what Rand is after. What she seeks to illustrate is that also good looks, and as beauty of every kind, is a value. It is something that should be appreciated, not ignored. And the same goes for seeking aesthetic pleasure. It's a good in itself. And it's even better when paired with being intellectually stimulating as well. They don't always come together, and when they do, usually not to the same degree, but they are both valuable parts of human existence and should be appreciated for it. Those of you who have read it might think of Dagny Taggart's disappointment after her first prom. This is one of the backgrounds from her upbringing. It's not a condemnation of making the effort of looking good or for the occasion of enjoying food, drink, and dance. It's a condemnation of people not living up to the promise of such an occasion. It's a condemnation, and that is what makes him silly or boring. Remember, now I'm going to spoil what Leopold was into before, Francisco d'Anconia's gratitude to the host Hank Reardon for him being able to have a house full of people in evening dresses when a storm and rain are raging outside, just like the roof is rattling here. Parties are a celebration of such human accomplishment. If you want to, I gladly elaborate on the role of parties and intoxication in human life during questions or afterwards. But the point here is that the aesthetics are part of it. As is conversation, such as Francisco offering a gratitude of philosophical importance or delivering his money speech at James Taggart's wedding. Why have we left it to the fools, says Dagny Taggart. Why have we left it to the fools? It should have been ours. These kinds of occasions are meant to be celebrations of the fact that we are human beings capable of both enjoyment and intellectual pursuit. That is what we do here at a gathering like that. The one is not the opposite of the other, unless not taken to extreme, of course. And that is what ties art to the riches in life in general, such as material affluence, liberty, and luxury. Horace Engdahl, as of course many have done before him, notes how the Renaissance in Florence was productive both for financial innovations, trade, and wealth creation, and a boom for the arts. The same can be said for the Netherlands. The Dutch Golden Age for paintings came in the 16th and 17th century, along with the flowering of trade, industry, and the sciences. And as described in great detail in Louis Menon's The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War, the United States after the war period also became a cultural dominant, not just in popular culture, but in art and literature as well. Regarding this period, let's note that although the American state and CIA as well was heavily involved in cultural development during the afterward period, it was not the state that controlled the process and decided the outcome. As Louis Menon writes, it was not the magazine The Partisan Review, modernist literature, or the Museum of Modern Art that rose to popularity, But pop art, Elvis Presley, beat literature and Hollywood movies, and might I add, Ayn Rand novels, that were selected mainly by the market. And it was also this culture that sifted through the Iron Curtain, and that was the appealing thing with the West. Only in a Stalinist economy, as described in Lea Yuppi's Free, about Albania under communism, only in a Stalinist economy can a Coca-Cola bottle become an object of luxury. It's hilarious if described it. That was luxury because it is only in the absence of a consumer society that ordinary objects of consumption are made sacred. But in the West, though, the growing consumer market also drove cultural development. In the 20th century rise of US culture, this market was driven especially by young women who for the first time had some money in their pockets and therefore became a force to be reckoned with. When the Beatles toured America in 1964, they sold, this was the album period referred to earlier, 11 million sold records was bought, half of them were bought by teenage girls. They made Beatles a big thing. Only much, much later the band was credited for their original and creative contribution to music. And this is a bit of what Giorgio was into. The market is not a perfect process for creating good culture, but much of what has started as consumer culture often later became recognized as quality, and much of what started as highly regarded alternatives to consumer culture in the sphere of culture and art is today more rightly recognized as something not worth paying for. And Horace Engdahl recognizes this as well. He writes that everywhere we see a richer and more diverse consumption, we see, quote, a higher value put on aesthetic expression of any kind. They go together. Aesthetic expression of any kind and of fantasy as an important power of the soul alongside reason. They rise together and they create fantastic things together. And there are actually some empirical evidence for this. A Swedish researcher called Leif Runefelt has written several books on the early consumption in Sweden, and it had a profound effect on our way of thinking. With global trade in the 18th century, the ability to import cloths and new colors came, and the whole of the traditional society in Sweden then felt that the end was near. The papers at the time actually saw it as worse than the Black Death that people started to experiment with colors and outfits. Can you imagine? Why did they think that? One reason was, of course, that they saw this as such a devastating threat. It was not only the misdirected mercantilist belief that you get rich from exporting, but poor from importing. Much more important, actually, was that one important way of manifesting your position in a society is through how you dress. And when a regular businessman, as well as farmers and farmers' wives, started wearing clothes or scarves with the color blue, for example, this threatened the hierarchical order of society. The extended possibility to consume new kind of textiles was a way for people to add some beauty to their quite dreary existence. But it was also a mean for people to aspire to another role in society, and than the one society has chosen for them. Remember that this was the age of guilds, when men were supposed to follow their father's footsteps, and women were married away without much consideration of their feelings. And of course, these thoughts must have inspired art as well. The novel is another product of the market, breaks through in the 19th century with the cheaper printing, and there was a market for this format. And these are some of the examples of how culture has influenced our thought. Now let's add another aspect borrowed from the aforementioned Horace Engdahl, namely luxury. One of the things about consumer society is that it created liberty and dignity and art going together. One other example from Sweden, when pictured commercials started to be used to sell women's clothing in the early 20th century in Sweden, this was the first time that a woman could be pictured looking at herself in the mirror without being condemned for it. Equality was expanded, as was freedom. The very word shopping represented the choice not to buy. Not many know this. Shopping meant that you could go into a store without buying what you looked at. Before that, before the warehouses, it was a strong implicit norm that if you went into a store and were waiting on, you had to buy something. Shopping created choice. And in this, much of this creation, culture was intertwined with production. We got the chemical industry from coloring clothing. Actually, the 19th century was quite colorful because Germany were coloring with early chemicals, and that was the basis for the chemical industry. And so all the way through, cloth and creativity was intertwined with production of necessities. And now let's go to luxury. In an economic sense, luxury is defined by scarcity and could almost anything can be scarce, such as Coca-Cola bottles. But the beauty of a productive society is, of course, that the product after product go from luxury for the few to everyday products for the many. Products from spices to smartphones has made this journey. But luxury is about wealth and taste as well. And I have neither, not much of neither, so I'm relying on theory here. But luxury, writes Horace Engdahl, is not about greed and the amassing of stuff, but it's based on taste, choice, and innovation. Yes, we have different tastes and make different choices, but before going into that, think of the fact that developing taste often requires the same things as productive work: thought and effort. To be able to make a judgment of taste as to whether French or American literature are to be preferred, you must have read quite a lot of literature. You must do the work first. It requires effort. Sometimes a little less effort, but even developing a taste in food requires more than just chewing or swallowing. Luxury, in this sense, writes Horace Engdahl, is a practice in the skill of living. Art is very much a product of this process, of both creators and consumers developing a taste, combining thought and effort for the purpose of aesthetic enjoyment. There are, of course, other factors influencing the art market and the development of art, but the connection to the personal thought and effort also among consumers is one reason I think that art has a tendency to flourish along with material riches and freedom. Not only free expression, but free markets as well. And in that, art is actually an integral part in the development of both riches and freedom, showing that spiritual freedom is to material benefit and vice versa. The luxury of human existence is that it's fundamentally not a choice between different good things in life, but the insight that life is the enjoyment of a lot of very different good things and aspirations, including aesthetic ones. And this is fitting with the virtue ethics, where there are immense combinations of virtues and aspirations that could sum up as a good life. There are many, many ways of leading a good life, looking very different. The possibilities are almost endless of making a good life. To finish, that is where I'm ordered to stop. Thank you very much.